So this is actually the passage in the Bible where apparently a man gives birth. And what we're basically doing today, we're looking at popular YouTube atheist Hemant Mehta's Everything Wrong with Genesis chapter 15, and we're basically putting it under the microscope. So if this is your first time here on the channel, my name is Israel. What we do here is we help you learn the Bible for yourself, master the Bible as we like to say, and avoid deception. So in today's session, we've got 6 clips to basically get through of Hemant Mehta. Hopefully this will be a blessing to you. Do not forget to press the thumbs up button if you like what we're doing, and obviously share this out with Christians that you obviously know and also atheists as well. Let's get into clip number 1 and see what Hemant Mehta has to say for himself first. Let's get started.
Genesis 15. God tells Abram that babies will come out of his butt. Hey, don't blame me, I did not write this book. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Yeah, God, you made me rich. You saved my life in battle, but you haven't given me children, and now a slave is gonna get all my stuff. So what the hell? What a rich little whiner. And why does God get credit for being Abram's shield? I would think the slave army of 318 people we saw in the last chapter had something to do with the victory. But here's God swooping in to remind everyone he's the real hero. Then the word of the Lord came.
All right, so a couple of points there first and foremost, which I think are actually quite interesting. What do we see first? So ultimately, the first thing I kind of thought about when I was basically watching his clips is Abraham's obviously talking to God in the narrative, and he's basically saying, look, the person that's going to become my heir is this person who's basically ruling over my household. And the thought that came to my mind was Hemant Mehta, that is, has made the continual scenario of slaves and servants and all these different kind of things. And the question that came to my mind was, where on earth do slaves, apparently, right, in the way we kind of understand it today as 21st century humans, right, inherit all of their rich slave owners' wealth? It doesn't make any sense. And it just is another one of those scenarios where the Bible is kind of highlighting that what we generally view as slavery or all these different kind of things was completely different in many of these cases. All right, cool. Secondly, the reason why what we've read so far to start this passage is really significant is because Abraham obviously knew, who's obviously Abram still at this point, Abraham knew the promises God had given him ultimately, or the promise in question in regards to what we're reading about now, was contingent on offspring. So the things God had promised to Abraham, look, I'm going to bless you and your seed, and I'm going to give you this particular land, all these different kind of things, were contingent on Abraham obviously having children. If Abraham didn't have children, obviously, then the things God was obviously saying to Abraham wouldn't obviously make sense. This is why obviously, or one of the reasons, Abraham is obviously petitioning God here and asking, where's the heir ultimately that I need to ultimately have these promises that you've actually given me to be fulfilled? All right. Now, the last thing I'll mention on this particular set of insights that he actually brought up here is he talked about ultimately the 318 stewards, servants in his household, the trained army that Abraham had. Now, this is interesting because he's obviously in this session so far, and obviously in the previous session he talked about this as well, he's asking, why is God swooping in and talking about how he's the shield, he's XYZ? What about the 318 trained in his own house? Don't they get any credit? But it's interesting because in the last session, and this is something we'll see over and over again, all of the links to previous sessions will be in the description box for you to consider watching after. He continues to flip-flop from one side to the other side. In the previous session, he was saying Abraham is taking just these 380 men into basically to a death trap. But now all of a sudden, the same scenario he said was a death trap. Now these people should get rewarded, should be blessed, or these people should get a credit or have an honorable mention in regards to who is actually the shield, when clearly God was obviously working amidst all of that whole scenario. And we talked about in the last session as well how Hemant actually made quite a few blunders in regards to the whole narrative of Abraham just going with 300 men. But let's go on to clip number 2 out of 6 and see what he has to say next. Let's continue.
To him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." How many stars are there? Billions and billions? That's how many kids this guy's gonna have, which means he should get working on that, like, now. I have 2 kids and I can't get anything done. Abram is in for quite a shock around child 100,000. Actually, it's been said you could see maybe 3,000 stars at any one time in perfect conditions. But didn't God say Abram's number of kids would equal the number of dust particles? That's wrong. And also, thousands of kids is still too many. I will go far as to say hundreds of kids are too many. You know what? Dozens of kids are too many. Somewhere, the Duggar family is reading these numbers and they're jealous. But here's the amazing thing. Other versions of the Bible translate God's words here by saying Abram's heir will be someone who comes forth out of thine own bowels. Seriously, he's gonna have a rectum baby, which is not how babies work. Imagine having thousands of butt babies. I know conservative Christians oppose sex education, but this is what happens when you don't know that stuff. Remember when Eve was created out of Adam's rib? Turns out that's not even close to the weirdest form of birth in Genesis. Abram believed the Lord, and he
All right, so a couple of more things there which are a bit interesting to basically get into, right? The first thing I'll highlight here, which I think is quite significant, it would seem to what Hemant is saying ultimately seems to suggest to us that he's basically misunderstanding or choosing to misunderstand the context of this whole narrative. Why? Because what God is actually speaking to Abraham about here, first and foremost, he does talk specifically, and we'll talk about this again in a moment, about an heir. That was the context, right? Abraham's asking, look, where's my heir coming from? I don't have an heir yet. That's the first thing. So God specifically was talking about an heir. But next, as you see throughout Genesis as well, this comes up over and over again, a handful of times, God is promising Abraham and his descendants multiple descendants. So he was clearly not saying, and I hope Hemant was just trying to say this in jest and really didn't actually think God was saying to Abraham to have thousands, millions, billions of children directly from his own body. Ultimately, that's clearly not what's happening. Now, the second thing which is significant about these whole comments that Hemant Mehta is actually making is this piece of text right here, this passage is very fundamental to Christians today. Why? Because Christians believe it's passages like this, the promise, the covenant that God obviously made with Abraham, like this, which basically through the faith that we have in God ultimately are grafted in, are able to access these blessings that God actually promised to Abraham, right? So we don't, or at least from my vantage point anyway, I don't believe the Christians replaced Israel or anything like that. But the point is, through faith, we access the covenant that God is actually making with Abraham. Whereas God is saying, look, through you, Abraham, the whole world will ultimately be blessed. And we believe as Christians, ultimately, what Jesus Christ obviously did is for the whole world and everyone has access to it, i.e. the promise is fulfilled in regards to Abraham. And ultimately, I'll leave it at that. Ultimately, they say there's at least 1 billion Christians on the planet right now. That isn't to say people that have obviously come previously that were Christians, and obviously previous people that will come after that are ultimately Christians as well. Either way, Abraham looking at the stars and trying to count stars, whether he could see 3,000, whether there's millions and millions of stars, etc., that has been, from a Christian perspective, brought out into fruition ultimately, as there are multiple people professing Christians today. Now, this is just foolish, ultimately, right? He talks about how, and I mentioned this at the start of this video, a man apparently giving birth to a baby. Now, clearly the Bible does not insinuate this. Even if you want to just take what we've covered so far in regards to Hemant Mehta's series, right, where I'm actually at currently on 15. Why do I say this? Because we've seen women obviously being the ones that give birth, which obviously lines up with what we believe today. Now, he basically reads I guess he's reading the NIV translation, then he quotes a different translation. The KJV, I know for a fact, is one of the translations that reads exactly verbatim how he basically said a man would obviously have a child come out of his bottom. Now, this is obviously foolish because throughout the Bible, especially KJV and other translations similar to the KJV, bowels are, well, just naturally anyway, bowels would refer to your stomach, right, your belly, etc. And it can go from the front to obviously the back. Now, he's obviously, I would hope, just trying to be a bit playful, trying to get people to be a bit more entertained. But clearly, that's not obviously what God was actually saying. In fact, we even see later on in Genesis, just to give you one example, God says to a woman that a baby will come through her womb and through her bowels, ultimately twin babies. So clearly, when you read through the Bible, the bowels are just a reference to the inner parts of the belly, ultimately. God is just saying to him, if you think about the whole context, it's about coming from within. That's it. The whole context is about Abraham having an heir, right? So obviously an heir directly from within his body, not an heir from outside the body, etc., as Abraham tried to suggest. Right, so I'll leave it at that. Let's go to clip number 3 out of 6. We can breeze through these clips ultimately by God's grace, and hopefully these sessions actually benefit to you. Let's jump to clip number 3 out of 6 and see what he has to say for himself next, because the whole butt baby thing was something to laugh about in and of itself, but there are more things which actually come out of today's session, which I think will be very beneficial and very educational and insightful for people who lack the understanding, it would seem, as Hemant Mehta actually does. Let's continue.
Form of birth in Genesis. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. What the hell? What sort of orgy are we planning here? I need you, your best friend, 3 infant llamas, a dying giraffe, and some baby oil. Some people just have faith. Others need a bunch of baby animals and birds for some reason before they'll trust God. But at least Abram will take care of these animals, right? Abram brought all these to...
All right, so a couple of things there which are quite interesting, and this is ultimately where it gets quite interesting. I'll just put it at that, right? And I've got a question for everyone, which ultimately help bring clarity to what we're talking about here, right? Now, notice this, which I think is actually quite interesting. So, first things first, right? This is the question, and I'll basically talk about why this is significant in a moment. So, this is the point here. So, Abraham, if you're following the narrative, is asking for proof, right? He's saying, Abraham's asking God, how am I going to know that this promise that you're actually saying to me, you're going to bless my descendants and I'm going to have seed come from within, etc. How am I going to know this stuff, basically, right? He wants proof. That's ultimately what Abraham's asking for. Now, this is where this question I've actually shared is actually insightful, because the question is, how do people give their word today and make it binding, right? If I was to ask anyone, and you can put it in the chat section, put it in the comment section below the video, if someone today wanted to outline and say, look, this is something that's going to happen, this is my word, it's going to happen, I want to make it binding, how would we do that, right? Now, notice this, because I think this is actually quite significant as well. The answer to this question that most people should be thinking about when it comes to what I'm talking about here is this, right? Today, or even today, ultimately, when we are going to bind ourselves to something, we bind ourselves by doing what? Signing on a dotted line, right? We sign a contract. Now, why is this significant? Because Abraham asked for proof. How am I going to know what you're saying is actually true, God? And what does God do? He obviously doesn't have, it would seem, any understanding or context. He maybe, I guess, didn't go and search out for any context. But what God is actually, or what you're seeing here, are the equivalent to what we would reference today as signing a contract, right? The procedure you're seeing here, God telling him to ultimately bring these particular animals, is the one way in which they used to basically come to an agreement. They would give their word ultimately. And we'll talk about this more as time goes on, because over the next couple of clips, he's going to bring this up again. And I know this will be beneficial. I'll give you an example of, for example, I'll give you a particular example later on in the Bible, how we know this is actually what's actually going on here, let alone what comes later on in the scriptures. And I mentioned this again in the last session. Over and over again, as we go through these particular sessions, looking at what Hemant Mehta has to say about Genesis, he regularly flip-flops from one side to the other side. And generally, all it takes is reading just a few more lines, and you'll get the answers that you're actually looking for. We'll see those answers come to fruition again and highlight this is exactly what's actually going on. But let's basically go to the next clip. And after the next clip, like I said, I'll give you an example from the Old Testament, which kind of outlines this particular scenario. So give me 2 seconds and let me do this. All right. So let's go to clip number 4 out of 6 and see what Hemant Mehta has to say.
Him cut them in two and arrange the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. He cut those animals in half? What was the point of that? I swear, the Bible should make you all vegetarians. Abel already sacrificed one animal in Genesis chapter 4. God killed off all the animals that were not on Noah's ark. Noah sacrificed one of each clean animal that was still on the ark, and still God is not satisfied. There is something seriously wrong with him. Why were the birds spared? I hope it's because Abram couldn't catch them. And what would have happened if the birds of prey ate the carcasses? Would God have wanted more animals to sacrifice? Or would God have said, "Oh no! Ah well, I guess I'll have to make my point without rotting flesh near me." As the sun was setting...
Alright, cool. So he's obviously added a bit more context now to the scripture, the narrative, and obviously he's played it up already. What's going on with all these particular animals? I've kind of prefaced this for you already in regards to what we're actually talking about here. Now, this was ultimately, like I said, this was a covenant, this was an agreement, this was a contract signing, ultimately, an old-fashioned contract signing, as we'd say today. Now, thinking about this and understanding this as an old-style contract kind of makes just signing on a dotted line seem really not so significant in the bigger scheme of things, if I'm completely honest, right? But ultimately, I want to show you a passage now in one of the major prophets, as we reference it today, the book of Jeremiah, because the book of Jeremiah gives us insights on what we've read so far in regards to Genesis, in regards to contracts. Hemant asks the question, why did Abraham cut the animals in half ultimately? Generally, what you'll find, and if you do research, I think I first heard about this whole procedure from the late Chuck Missler, right? He talked about this and this kind of procedure here, but it's actually quite interesting when you really like jump into other scriptures and you can see what the Bible really has to say. And I'll show you that example in a moment, right, from the book of Jeremiah. But what would basically happen was you would basically bring things to the table, ultimately, so to speak, as Abraham did. He brought 5 different animals, and you'd basically chop them in half and you'd let the blood spill out, and it was a way to bind yourself to an agreement. And ultimately the death of these animals symbolizes ultimately like the significance. And you would basically say things, it says when you research this things which would be like, if I don't stick to my word, if I'm not bound by these words that we're actually in agreement, we're basically making, so be it to me as these dead carcasses, etc. So this gives you insights as to why Abraham's obviously killing the animals. Hemant actually references this already. We've seen animals die previously in regards to sacrifices and offerings, so it's not the most far-fetched thing anyway. Now let me show you this passage, because I think this is actually quite interesting. This is in the book of Jeremiah, and this is God himself speaking, telling Jeremiah what to say to the people. And what does he say? We'll just look at a couple of lines because it will give you the insights here, right? Now this is, like I said, God speaking. And what does he say? You have not hearkened unto me. And he's basically talking about how they broke his law, right? And what does he say? And I will give the men that have transgressed what? My covenant, right? Which have not performed, notice this, the words of the covenant, which they made before me. Now, notice this is the key part here. What does he say? When they cut the calf in twain, twain is basically Old English for two, and did what? And passed between the parts thereof. So, I'm going to punish, God is saying, the people that broke my covenant. And the words that they were supposed to perform based on the covenant, when they did what? When they killed, obviously, an animal, they cut it in two, and they passed between the parts. The custom was that at least two people would, like I said, chop up an animal, right? And they would pass between the parts. You read about people saying you would pass between in a figure of 8, right? Ultimately, as a sign of like infinity, or a sign of like perfection of some sort. But ultimately, they would pass between the parts. And that would be, some say, you'd even say, I remember the late Chuck Missy saying this at the time as well. Some would say, as they're passing through these parts in a figure of 8, they would basically be reciting the words of the covenant. So whatever terms they've actually brought to the table, you'd actually be saying these things ultimately as you're passing between these two pieces, or the pieces of the animal, etc. So that is obviously what God is obviously referring to here. And it goes even more specific again, because what do we see? God reiterates it, which is not a far-fetched thing in the Bible. We see repetition regularly. He says, the princes of Judah and the princes of Jerusalem, the eunuchs and the priests, and all the people of the land. So the whole of the people obviously all entered into this covenant, which did what? Which passed between the parts of the calf, right? So you can see right there, God is alluding to what? A covenant practice where animals would be chopped in half and you'd pass between the paths ultimately, and your words would be bound. You'd be bound by the words ultimately of what you actually said. Hopefully this is making sense. Ecosmios asked a good question. She said, is he a vegan? I believe he is. I believe I've mentioned he is a vegan in previous videos. I believe he's also mentioned he's a vegan in previous text videos as well. Hopefully that helps. Let's go on to clip number 5. And before we go to clip number 5, this is a funny one. I want you to remember ultimately, right, what he referenced about God wiping out the whole world with a flood. He basically listed off a list of things and said, look, God's already done this and this and this, and all of these different people have died, and God is still not happy. He still needs sacrifice. Now, again, because he's a vegan, we can understand to a certain degree why he seems to be so concerned with animals, and obviously animals being killed. Ultimately, the majority of the world would not agree with him in that regard, because animals are killed by the masses on a day-to-day basis. But also what I think is interesting as well is, as a Christian, from a Christian perspective, clearly we believe that the things God sets up are obviously acceptable. If God has obviously clearly set up a sacrificial system right from the Garden of Eden, once Adam and Eve had obviously sinned, and obviously he's covering their sin, etc. with coats of skins, we clearly see that God is obviously initiating this and this is acceptable. But remember what he said about the flood, because that will come up in clip number 5 out of 6 ultimately. So let's go on to the penultimate clip ultimately in today's session and see what he has to say for himself next. Let's keep going.
Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." A thick and dreadful darkness would come over me too if I knew what was going to go through my intestines in the near future. That's an odd dream, by the way. God tells him, listen, everyone that comes out of your butt will be a slave for centuries. But relax, I'm going to punish the country eventually, and then those slaves are going to be rich. If God knows all that, why not just stop it? God is knowingly letting innocent people become slaves for 400 years before he takes revenge on the nations. And how come all-knowing God didn't warn Abram that Lot would be kidnapped in the last chapter? These are very selective psychic abilities. And Abram will be buried at a good old age? What is that now? I thought the limit was 120. I mean, that's not a bad run, but it kind of sucks compared to everyone else we've heard about so far. When the sun had set...
Alright, so penultimate clip that we basically just went through, right? And this, I said in the previous commentary on the previous clip, right? Remember what he said about the flood of Noah, because this is clear for everyone to see, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Over and over again, whenever you listen to an atheist, these kind of scenarios that I believe put atheists in a conundrum, who basically try and raise this point up, always arises. Firstly, he talks about Abraham going into a dream. Like, the narrative kind of shows us and suggests to us it wasn't obviously a dream. We'd reference it more likely today as a nightmare, right? When you're sleeping in a deep sleep or whatever, when you're in a sleep and you're seeing things that aren't necessarily the best, we generally will reference that as a nightmare, right? That's kind of just self-explanatory. An the reason I asked you to remember him bringing up the flood and all these different kind of things is because I believe personally it just continues to show an inconsistency. Why? Because he says, look, God brought the flood and God did this and God did all these different things related to death, but now God is basically leaving these people to suffer for 400 years before God obviously brings judgment. And this is where the inconsistency lies on the part of an atheist who tries to bring up rules of morality or injustice in God's part. Why? Because he complains when God basically brings the flood imminently and judges the people. But then he complains and says, wait, hold on. Why is God obviously giving a nation or nations 400 plus years to change their ways? It makes no sense. It's almost impossible for you to try and take both sides of the fence and be consistent. It makes no sense. Why? Because if God is going to say, look, you know what? This punishment that I'm going to give you is going to wipe all of you out. The question I ask Hemant is this. You're trying to claim there's a problem with God giving people time to change. What do you expect God to do? What would you have God do, Hemant? You would ultimately say, what? God should stop it. Well, how should God stop it? If God is ultimately going to punish these people and the punishment is worthy of, the death is a worthy punishment for what these people are doing. We talked about this, I believe, 2 or 3 sessions ago. Ultimately, some of the practices these people are doing, ultimately. This is textbook. We see this over and over again in the Old Testament, and this is why sometimes some of the questions people raise is mind-boggling, because people act as if God is knee-jerk. God always gives people time. I'll bring that up in a moment, right? In a little bit. But notice this. Let's continue thinking about what Hemat's actually raising. He's acting as if, why would he want to know all of these different kind of things? Like, this isn't really good news, etc. But the point is, knowing that even though there may be some turmoil, some like detrimental things to your lineage in the near horizon, but at the same time knowing that after those detrimental bad things that are going to happen to the nation, to your nation, good is actually going to come. You are going to return into this land wealthy and full. It's much better knowing that there's light at the end of the tunnel opposed to going through a dark tunnel and having no insights as to what's actually going to come out. This is why what's actually happening, what God actually says to him, is actually quite significant. And it's actually a great scenario compared to just having all of this stuff without any insights. Now, this is the second part of the dilemma that I want to highlight in regards to Hemant Mehta. Why is God giving these people time? God should act now. But when God acts now in the flood, and even God gave them time in that particular time as well, he complains. Why is God doing all this, etc.? And then he's going to complain about the punishment. Why should God punish in this way? Well, God should punish in another way. Listen to an atheist, many atheists anyway, long enough, and you'll see the inconsistencies over and over again. Whereas a Christian says, look, you know what? What God says is binding. If God says this is wrong, we believe obviously God is the most justified person, the most righteous. He will always judge accordingly. And we'll bring that up in a moment again. But notice what he's really saying. He's saying, look, these people are doing wickedness and will continue to do wickedness according to what God says for 400 plus years. Why doesn't God stop them? Inadvertently, what is he asking for? He's asking for God to take away these Canaanites' free will. He wants to take their free will away so God can prohibit these people from doing particular actions just so they don't continue. Whereas God will always justly say, look, you know what? God will give a nation 400 years to change their ways. Why? Because, or 400 plus years, because they've already obviously been doing wickedness. He will give you that time because when God now judges you, realistically, if you're going to be objective and look at this naturally, right? Realistically, you will no longer have any more reason to complain. And this is what's mind-boggling, because many of us today still try and find fault with God. So for example, let's say there was a criminal, right, who went on some killing spree. We today, for example, would say, look, you know what? No, you know what? Like, let's punish him right now and that's it. What God turns around and says, look, everyone here is guilty. Everyone here is guilty. So I'm going to set up my justice system. God says, you know what? I'm going to give you time. So when I really judge you, and even if this judgment is severe or really significant, you will have no grounds to complain. Why? Because I've given you more than enough time. More than enough time. And you know what? Sometimes it may not even be you that reach or feel the full burden. It may be someone later down the line, right? But even if it's someone later down the line, God has still showcased and said, look, I'm going to give you a lot of time to change. It was the same thing with the flood, right? God gave them time. Obviously, Noah's building an ark, etc. And then God turned around and said, okay, cool. This is enough. Now I'm going to wipe everything out. God didn't just say, you know what, make an ark, Noah, on one day, and then the next day the flood was there and everything was gone. God would be justified to do this, but God still gave them ultimately time. And if you do references, if you study this out, people would say 100 years, 120 years, etc. But we know clearly God gave them a lot of time to basically change. And I believe it's passages like this that highlight and show God nicely, right? I've said this before, God will ultimately continue to give you time. So it's indisputable. The Canaanites that will get judged in 400 years, when you get to the book of Exodus, etc., and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Judges, they have no complaints because God has given them all of this time to change. Now, what's even interesting when you read through Genesis and you find out how the Israelites get into Egypt, and this is the last point I'll make in regard to his final clip, This is significant because it's through their own deceit, right, that they ultimately get into Israel, into Egypt, and ultimately are then put in a position to be subjugated, right? So again, even in the flow of this narrative, Hemant tried to say they were innocent. They were really not innocent when you actually read the context as time goes on in Genesis. Let's go on to the final clip and see ultimately what Hemant has to say, right? And let's continue. Last clip, and then I'll wrap up with any comments that I feel to address. Clip number 6 coming up.
And darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Well, Abram, better get cracking on all those babies so they can take over all this space. Try some squats. Whenever random, unnecessary animal sacrifice isn't even close to the weirdest thing in the chapter, you know you're entering a messed up section of the Bible.
So what do we see to wrap up the text? A couple of things which are quite interesting. So I mentioned this previously, right? The text ultimately highlights, what does it highlight to us in the text? The text highlights to us that God obviously made a covenant with Abraham, right? He read it himself. That day, God made a covenant with Abraham. It's quite clear. The scripture says it quite clearly. And that obviously, like I said, alludes to the whole scenario of the passing between the animals, right? Now, what's obviously interesting about this whole narrative as well is we know that obviously God made a covenant. We know from reading Jeremiah, which gives us more insights as to at least one practice which went on in certain covenants where people would cut animals in half, as Abraham did, and ultimately people would obviously pass between the parts. Now, what's actually interesting in this, the scripture talks about how a smoke and a lamp is passing through while Abraham is in a deep sleep. And this is vital because most people accept and believe that that was a reference, that was alluding to God passing between the parts, basically engaging in a contract. The significant thing about this though is Abraham is supposed to be the other party passing through, reciting the words of the oath, the contract. But the problem in the scenario or it's not even a problem to be honest, but the funny thing about the scenario is Abraham, as you know, is in a deep sleep. So Abraham didn't pass through the animals. And this is obviously a sign, a token of God ultimately showing that this covenant was unbreakable. Why? Because God basically went through the animals himself. So just to kind of give you a modern context, this would be like someone having two people coming to have a contract and one of the people ultimately signing both names on the contract. So even though there's a contract between two parties, the one party says, look, I'm signing both signs, both name places. Why? Because I want you to know that there's nothing you can do now. I'm bound in this contract. You are not bound. So the promise from God to Abraham that he will bless his descendants and this land I'm giving to you, that was contingent on God alone, based on the practice of the contract, because Abraham was in a deep sleep, while what seems to be the presence, the glory of God was actually passing between the animals, signifying the signing of a contract. Now, ultimately, you can read about this in Hebrews, ultimately, in the middle of Hebrews, where it talks about God not being able to swear by anything greater, right? There's nothing greater than God. So ultimately, what could he do? He can ultimately swear by his own name, right? And that is ultimately a sign, again, of what God was actually doing. God obviously entered this contract with Abraham, but didn't let Abraham have the opportunity through the custom of walking through the pieces to ultimately break the contract in any different way. So this was what we referenced as an unconditional covenant, an unconditional promise from God to ultimately Abraham. So those are the 6 clips ultimately from Hemant Mehta in today's session. Ultimately, what else? The other thing we need to see, which I think is actually quite interesting, I'll bring this up, and these are the kind of things that come up from time to time as well, right? This is Faye Wintersong obviously saying, look, just in all honesty, she hates hearing this guy, right? And I know, like don't get me wrong, like I feel your pain, I feel and I understand. Many Christians listening to someone like Hemant Mehta will listen and be angry to hear what he's actually saying, right? But why? Because we're Christians, we hold the Bible sacred, we believe it's God's word, etc. And ultimately, from his behavior, he doesn't, right? He doesn't seem to hold any reverence for the scriptures. Now, my whole vantage point in regards to this is, and I'll continue to say this, right? As Christians, we need to be better, right? We need to look past what he's saying and what he's doing and think beyond Hemant Mehta in some senses, right? These sessions, I hope, are sessions that Hemant Mehta can watch himself and question himself. Okay, he said this, Israel said this. Was I right? Was I wrong? Etc. and stuff like that, right? I'd hope he does it, but also his audience that hear him say things like there's a man that's going to give birth, when literally just bowels are just your belly ultimately, right? Your insides. And obviously words have a meaning, and obviously words have meaning in context as well. But if he's going around saying, look, you know what? The Bible's saying in chapter 15 that a man's going to have a baby out of his bottom. Like, I need to look past just the foolishness and the jokes and all these different kind of things, and obviously help Christians who obviously I'm here to serve, but also at the same time, right? I know that there'll be atheists that will potentially watch this stuff, and I want to obviously allow the Holy Spirit to minister to those people as well. And again, the ultimate goal is for anyone to watch these videos and not to take what I say or to take what he says for granted or for gospel. Listen to what we're both saying, go and analyze the text that's there, written in stone, and see whose points are accurate, who's right. And that's all we can obviously hope for at the end of the day, that anyone, as God desires, for anyone to come to the Bible in truth. And I obviously believe anyone, Hemant Mehta included, if he comes to the Bible in truth and deals with many of the points I'm making contextually based on what he's saying and what the scripture actually says and what I say the scripture actually says, bit of a tongue twister there, he will have to concede many of the points he's actually made. But at the end of the day, if you've got hundreds, thousands of people potentially praising you, thinking that you're doing a good thing, in many cases, it's going to be hard for you to turn around and say, you know what, I was wrong, I want to change, and you know what, like, let me not say a lot of these things. Let me take more time before I make these different sessions on what the Bible actually says. So hopefully, Faye, that helps you and everyone else that ultimately may be feeling the exact same way. This is obviously something really significant that many people are dealing with. But again, I was saying to someone earlier on today, right? Just thank God that at least in his sessions, he hasn't really brought anything that's really spectacular. So the point in a scenario like this is just to get the word out. This is why I say regularly, share this out with Christians, you know, share this out with atheists, right? And I was saying to my wife, I believe earlier on, I was saying this to someone else in the conversation I alluded to as well. I didn't say this to my wife. I was saying that, look, it's interesting how sometimes it's the things which are not really that significant that have a big effect. And what I mean by that is sessions like Meta sessions like this that can sway a lot of people because he's charismatic in one way and comes off very confident, and people believe exactly what he's saying. So when you can put words, you can say words out and obviously put them to text on the screen. Many people are not thinking, you know what, Hemant Mehta is lying, or Hemant Mehta is deceived, or Hemant Mehta is ignorant. Excuse me, let me go and fact check. Instead, they're just like, oh, you know what, Hemant Mehta is truthful. He's telling me, like, yeah, there's fun and games in here, but what he's actually saying is true. When just by taking a bit of time to examine what he's actually saying, you realize some of the very big holes in his narrative, right? So hopefully this has been a blessed session for everyone that's tuned in live, and obviously those who watch it on a replay. I want to wrap it up there And thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks everyone for supporting in any ways in which you do, whether it just be liking the video, sharing this out, whether it's you subscribing, or for those of you who obviously go a step further and support financially. Either way, thanks for tuning into today's session. God bless, and I'll see you tomorrow, right, bright and early, with a new video upload, which will be a nice one for you as well. Thanks and take care, and I'll see you soon.